Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Peter DeShazo. I'm a visiting professor of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies at the college. On behalf of the LILACS program, Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies, the Dickey Center and the Rockefeller Center were delighted to be able to host this event. The bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States is essential for both countries. We share nearly a 2,000-mile border with 56 crossing points. About 300,000 vehicles a day cross the border. Myriad government and non-government entities at the federal, state, and municipal levels are involved in border management. If the 4 U.S. states on the border and the 6 Mexican states were combined, they would be the 4th largest economy in the world. Demographics. Some 10% of the U.S. population is of Mexican heritage or descent, and an estimated 1 million or so Americans live in Mexico. So the two societies are deeply interconnected. Economics. Mexico is the 3rd largest U.S. trade partner, the United States the largest trade partner of Mexico. Mexico is the 2nd largest export market for U.S. products. Bilateral trade runs at the rate of about $1 million a minute. An estimated 5 million U.S. jobs depend on trade with Mexico, 22,000 of them here in New Hampshire, according to a recent study by the Woodrow Wilson Center. Total U.S. investment in Mexico hovers around $250 billion. Mexico, of course, is a partner in NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, along with the United States and Canada, linking those 3 economies in a blockbuster powerhouse trade bloc. In other key areas, security, energy, education, water management, the environment, health, cooperation between Mexico and the United States has grown exponentially in past decades. Past U.S. administrations recognize the centrality of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. Presidents Reagan, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama all made official visits to Mexico before taking office or soon after having been inaugurated. This notwithstanding, the bilateral relationship with Mexico appears to be in flux. Rhetoric about Mexico and Mexicans from the Trump primary and presidential campaigns and early signs from President Trump's administration point to a very different outlook about Mexico. At this important time, I can think of no one better prepared to discuss the past, present, and future outlook for the key U.S.-Mexican relationship than Ambassador Arturo Sarukhan. As the ambassador of Mexico to the United States from 2007 to 2013, a period encompassing both the George W. Bush and Obama administrations, he was the government of Mexico's point person in managing the complex web of bilateral relations. In doing so, he gained a reputation as one of the brightest stars in the diplomatic community in Washington, noted for his deep credibility with both the executive branch and the U.S. government and on Capitol Hill. Ambassador Sarukhan's success has stemmed from his deep knowledge of the United States. A career diplomat, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Inter-American Affairs of the Mexican Foreign Ministry and as Mexican Consul General in New York. He was also Chief of Policy Planning for the Foreign Ministry of Mexico. Ambassador Sarukhan has a bachelor's degree from El Colegio de Mexico and a master's degree in U.S. Foreign Policy from the School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, of Johns Hopkins, where he was a Fulbright Scholar and a Ford Foundation Fellow. He has taught at ITAM and the National Defense College in Mexico, and at the National Defense University and George Washington University in the United States. He's been a distinguished diplomat in residence or fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, the Brookings Institution, and the Annenberg School at the University of Southern California. He's presently president of Sarukhan Associates, LLC, in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Sarukhan.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for your kind words. I almost didn't make it, thanks to the fog this morning, but I'm glad I'm here. I'm reminded of the challenges of public speaking in hot climates like the one that we have outside right now. It happened to President Howard Taft, close to sort of this time of the year. He was in New York City, and he was speaking to union members in one of these big union halls. And at the time, there was a U.S. senator called Chauncey Pugh. And he had the reputation of being a very glib, very long-winded, very frivolous speaker. And so Senator Pugh comes up to the dais and introduces President Taft and goes on and on and on, and everyone's sweating and the room's sweltering, no air conditioning. And finally, after about half an hour of long-winded remarks, asks the president to join him on the dais and says, ladies, I don't know if there were ladies in the room, but gentlemen at least, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing to you President William Howard Taft, President of the United States, a man pregnant with courage and pregnant with integrity. Howard Taft comes up to the dais, looks at the senator, scratches his head, and says, well, if it's a girl, I'll call her integrity. If it's a boy, I'll call him courage. But if it's just a gas, I'm going to call him Chauncey Pugh. So, this is a speech. It's warm. It's the end of the afternoon, so we'll try and keep this as lively as possible. And I've been asked to allow for some questions at the end of my opening remarks, which I'm more than glad to do. In 1985, one in a long line of very, very distinguished U.S. correspondents that have gone to Mexico. He was actually a Brit, but he was the correspondent for the New York Times, Alan Riding. Wrote a book which, since publication in '85, has sort of become there are many other new books, but this sort of continues to define, if someone asks me which book I should read in terms of getting historical perspective and framework for the U.S.-Mexico relationship, it's certainly Alan Riding's book. It's called Distant Neighbors. And it was written in 1985. He had been in Mexico for about 10 years when he published the book. And it attempted to explain to the general U.S. public why this relationship between these two neighbors was so complex and so convoluted. And there were two very important things happening at the time of publication that explained not only why the book was called Distant Neighbors, but that also helped to frame and compare what has happened since then in the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship and what's happening today with the 2016 presidential campaign and with Donald Trump in the White House and the impact that's having on U.S.-Mexican affairs. When Alan and I had the honor of awarding him the Aztec Eagle, which is Mexico's highest decoration to foreigners for the book that he wrote when I was ambassador. When Alan wrote the book, there were two things that in modern history had placed the U.S.-Mexico bilateral agenda in probably the lowest point since the last U.S. invasion of Mexican soil during the Mexican Revolution, 1917, when the Marines bombarded and invaded the city of Veracruz during the Mexican Revolution. And the two things that were happening at this moment were, one, for the first and only time in the history of U.S.-Mexican relations, the top foreign policy priority of the Mexican government of the time collided with one of the top three foreign policy priorities of the Reagan administration, Central America. Mexico was deeply involved in the negotiation for peaceful resolution to the civil conflicts that engulfed the Central American nations throughout the 80s and late 70s. Mexico was instrumental in setting up the so-called Contadora group with Venezuela, Panama, and Costa Rica that sought to not only mediate in Nicaragua, but also famously Mexico and France recognized the then Frente Farabundo Martí de Liberación Nacional as a belligerent movement, ergo giving it recognition via the UN that completely changed the dynamics of the negotiation process between the Salvadoran government and the FMLN. But if you remember what the policy of the United States at the time was, you can very quickly see how these two very different geostrategic views clashed in Central America. It's the only time in the history of the bilateral relationship where we have clashed not because of issues in the bilateral relationship per se, but because of other issues that have nothing to do with the US-Mexico bilateral relationship per se. To the point where, to this day, the two heads of our diplomacies, George Shultz and Bernardo Sepúlveda, the Mexican foreign minister, cannot be in a room like this together because of the animosity that those very complex years triggered between the Mexican foreign ministry and the State Department. And in the midst of this, you had one issue, this one related to the Mexico U.S. bilateral agenda, which almost scuppered bilateral ties. The abduction and murder of a DEA agent in Mexico, Enrique Camarena, in 1985. So an exogenous event, Central America, and a bilateral, an issue related to the bilateral agenda, which was obviously counter-narcotics cooperation, the abduction and murder of this DEA agent, plummeted the bilateral relationship. And this is when the book comes out. And so a lot of people use this book as sort of a ways of understanding how to re-engage and redirect the US-Mexico bilateral relationship. But what's even more stunning is that a few years later, 6 years later, in fact, Mexico and the United States are in the midst of a negotiation over a free trade agreement, NAFTA in 1991. What happened in those 5 years? First, a change of government, which always helps, both in Mexico and in the United States. But two presidents, a Mexican president and a US president, Carlos Salinas, George Bush 41, that understood that in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War in Europe, that Europe was going to start looking at its own navel. It was going to be preoccupied with everything from German reunification to the expansion of the then European community. And they understand the unique moment of being able to rethink how North America competed on a global stage where Europe was going to become a more salient player, obviously as a result of the end of the Cold War and German reunification, and the slow but telling rise of China and the Asian century. So they very quickly figured out that they had to start thinking outside the box, and that's when NAFTA materialized. And NAFTA became one of two profound seismic shifts that altered the face of Mexican-U.S. relations. That distant neighbor description that Alan Riding has in his book starts changing as a result of the NAFTA negotiation in 1993, when we finally agreed to a text and have Congress approve the text. Why? Because NAFTA fundamentally changes the economic dynamics between Mexico and the United States. Peter has shared with you some of the data. But it is very compelling to say that as a result of NAFTA, Mexico and the United States trade $1.4 billion a day of goods in both directions. $1.4 billion a day of goods. There are 26 states in the United States today that have Mexico as their #1 trading partner. We buy more US goods than any other country on the face of the earth except Canada. And to give you sort of a perspective of what this means or what this looks like, let me give it to you in different geographic samples, because I know this is a very diverse crowd, so there will be Latin Americanists, but I'm sure there will be people who focus on other regions of the world. Mexico today buys more US exports than all of Latin America and the Caribbean combined. Or to put it in another geopolitical context, Mexico buys more exports than the 4 BRIC nations together: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Or Mexico buys more US exports than China and Japan combined. Or, now that Britain is leaving the European Union, and the Brexit is Brexit, if we now kick out the UK today from the European Union, Mexico buys more US exports than all of the European Union countries together buy from the United States. And this very powerful trade agenda starts changing not only the interaction between governments that have to start understanding ways to deal with such a complex and novel economic relationship that had not existed before, but it also starts changing models and paradigms of production. Despite what you've heard on the campaign trail in 2016, no, this is not the worst trade deal that America has seen in its life. Why? Because what has developed, thanks to NAFTA, is a new economic paradigm which can basically be seen developing in the North American region. When NAFTA started out, the paradigm was the maquiladora program, you remember. Pieces of a refrigerator were sent across the border into Ciudad Juarez. They were assembled as a refrigerator, and they were sent back to Sears Roebuck or Walmart to be sold as a refrigerator. But about 10 years ago, this changed dramatically because value added started kicking in, enhanced human capital in Mexico started changing the paradigm of production, and what you now see is the new generation General Electric turbofan for the Dreamliner being retweaked in Mexico, in Querétaro. That turbine comes across the border with Canada and the United States 8 or 9 times with value added coming back and forth until the final product is finished. What this means is out of every dollar of Mexican exports to the United States today, 40 cents, 0.40, 40 cents out of every dollar of Mexican exports are of US content. So Donald Trump, if you want to slap 20% tariffs on Mexican exports to the United States, be my guest. You're scoring an own goal against 40 cents of US content that go into every dollar of US exports. You are not building US products anymore. We're not building Mexican products anymore. We're building North American products. And that has dramatically changed how we produce and how we compete. With NAFTA comes the second part of this seismic shift, 9/11. Why? Because you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that this economic relationship that I've described would be torpedoed if there were to be, in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the perception in the United States that a threat has materialized from the border with Mexico as to terrorist organizations seeking to undermine the security of the United States. So again, despite the rhetoric of the 2016 campaign, Mexico and the United States have been working hand in hand since 9/11 to ensure that terrorist organizations cannot use the Mexico U.S. border to undermine the security of the United States. And to this day, we have detained, since 9/11, two individuals on a Tier 2 watch list trying to come into Mexico with the alleged intent of then crossing the border into the United States. Why? Because the intelligence sharing that was developed between Mexico and the United States since 9/11, in terms of sharing information of passengers and those who were flying, because one of the things that we immediately understood was going to happen, if someone on the watch list was denied a visa to come to the United States, he or she would probably do visa shopping. They'd try to go into Canada, or they'd try and go into Mexico, and then from there, cross the border into the United States. So we needed to collate the information of passenger lists of all the airlines, all the flights coming into Mexican airspace and Canadian airspace, and sharing that information with our counterparts in the US government to ensure that we did not have potential terrorists trying to enter North American common domain space. And this starts changing the other pillar of the relationship. NAFTA changed the economic and trade relationship and the linkages between cities, especially in that transborder region on both sides of the border. And 9/11 starts changing the way we talk about and engage on security matters after the assassination of Agent Camarena. And this only deepens as a result of the decision of the previous Mexican government, starting in 2007, to frontally combat transnational criminal organizations. The type of collaboration that is developed with President Bush 43 and then President Obama to confront transnational criminal organizations, whether it's drugs coming in one direction or guns and bulk cash coming in the other, developed a template for collaboration that had never been seen in the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship before, ever. Mexican liaison officers in NORTHCOM at Colorado Springs, Mexico using U.S. drones for signals intelligence to be able to intercept communications between organized criminal organizations, a number of things that had never, that 10, 15 years ago would have been political suicide for any Mexican president to do in the relationship with the United States. And I mention these two paradigmatic shifts because in relatively short span of years, if you compare to where we were last year to where Alan Riding had left off his book, there is a huge shift in the nature and the strategic traction of the bilateral relationship. This doesn't mean that everything has been since then, or had been since then, rosy and peachy. This is a profoundly asymmetrical relationship in terms of power. Mexico is not a military superpower. Yes, we're the 13th largest economy in the world, but we're nowhere close to what the U.S. is. So for a relationship as asymmetrical as this one, there have always been hiccups and issues that have challenged both governments, whether because the Mexican government did something that Washington did not like, or vice versa. But despite this, there was an understanding that these were two countries joined at the hip for the good, that the success of one meant the success of the other, and that a paradigm of joint responsibility had to drive the relationship. What does this mean? That if we were to tackle some of the very vexing and challenging issues of the bilateral relationship, whether it's drugs and thugs, or whether it's immigration, or whether it's water on the border, we needed to understand that both countries had a role to play in constructively addressing this. That the finger pointing, the mutual recrimination of the past would serve neither country any good. Before this seismic shift in the collaboration on the drug trafficking front during the days of the Camarena abduction, it was very popular for U.S. policymakers, and Peter, you'll remember this when certification still existed as a process on Capitol Hill, where U.S. officials would wag their finger at Mexico and say, oh, Mexico is the springboard of all the drugs coming into the United States. And Mexican politicians would obviously and jingoistically retort, if we're the springboard, you're the swimming pool. And finally, both countries understood that, that paradigm would serve no country well. And these dramatic shifts that occurred created a sense of strategic momentum in the relationship. And then the 2016 presidential election happened. I don't have to tell anyone in this room what happened in terms of the Mexican agenda in the 2016 presidential election. Mexico was used by President Trump as a political piñata on three fronts, which all have a profound bearing on the relationship with Mexico. Border security, the wall, trade, NAFTA, the worst deal ever, and the xenophobia and nativism emanating from the White House these days as it relates to the bad hombres and the rapists coming from Mexico into the United States. So number one, it's not surprising. Pew Research Institute came out with a poll, I think it was in July of this year, as to what has happened to public perceptions and favorability ratings, favorable perceptions of the United States and favorability ratings of the incumbent U.S. president. You don't have to be Kissinger to figure out that the country with the highest negative perceptions of the United States and the lowest favorability ratings of the current incumbent president of the United States is Mexico, by far. 92, according to the Pew poll, 92% of all Mexicans polled have a bad opinion, bless you, of the United States. And this is a huge problem because despite the fact that the day-to-day government-to-government relationship between Mexico and the United States, bless you, more or less functions, the largest challenge that Donald Trump has uncorked is that he has wound back public perceptions 20 years in terms of convincing Americans and Mexicans that they need to be co-stakeholders to each other's success and well-being and prosperity. I don't think that the relationship has seen such a challenging and vexing moment since the days of 1985, like the one that we're living in right now. Even though some of the Mexico bashing has more or less subsided in the past month and a half, if NAFTA does get derailed, which is still a distinct possibility, the third round of negotiations is taking place right now as we speak in Ottawa. It ends tomorrow. But if either the negotiations blow up because of the Sinatra doctrine of President Trump that it's my way or the highway when it comes to specific issues that he wants to obtain in the NAFTA negotiations, and we can talk about this in depth if you want in the questions and answers, or if because simply he's not going to have the patience to see the process throughout because whoever thinks that we're going to have this done in December is smoking too much of the stuff that you're producing legally in the United States and that we're seizing in Mexico. It's not going to happen. The best scenario is that we will have a NAFTA ratified by the U.S. Congress by the lame duck session of next year, after the 2018 midterms. So the big question is, does this president have the temperance to wait out until November of next year because of domestic pressures? Or is he going to press the nuclear button and say the United States pulls out of NAFTA? If that happens, Mexico will survive, the U.S. will survive, and Canada will survive. But the damage that that will do to the trust, the government-to-government fabric, the perceptions on both sides of the border will be a unique challenge for those who are still in government today. As I look forward, and again think of Alan Riding, in many ways the relationship right now, because of Trump, is sort of, we moved away from a relationship of distant neighborhood, but we're not quite strategic partners. And let me give you three policy examples to illustrate this. Where we have clearly become strategic partners is in trade, again, for the reasons that I mentioned. But given that NAFTA is being seriously undermined and challenged, if that goes under, that's going to open a whole new can of worms. There's a second issue where we're sort of in the middle, where we've started to develop a strategic partnership, but we still have some prescient challenges. And that clear policy example is the fight against illicit drugs. Not only had Mexico and the United States moved away from that finger pointing and mutual recrimination, we had started to use this template developed in the bilateral relationship to start addressing other global and regional security issues, something that, again, had never happened in the bilateral relationship. What does this mean? The Mexico and the United States were not only talking about how do we fight organized crime on both sides of the border. We were talking about organized crime routes throughout the Americas. We were talking about nuclear disarmament in the Middle East. We were talking about a Peter Sellers Inspector Clouseau. For those of you who are old like me in the room, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The younger ones are going to say, what's that? You can Google it. There was a bumbling detective that was very famous in the movies and it made me squeal in laughter in the cinema, called Peter Sellers, when we found out that an Iranian operative linked to the Al-Quds brigade in Tehran was seeking to hire a Mexican cell of the Zetas to assassinate my Saudi counterpart in Washington, D.C., in a very famous restaurant that you know well, Café Milano. I even tweeted when the new administration started coming into D.C. and they all started going out for dinner at Café Milano. I couldn't. This is one of the beauties of being a recovering diplomat. I can now say whatever I want. I tweeted, Trump complains that Mexico is not a partner to the United States. Well, they're having dinner at Café Milano because Mexico and the United States were able to ensure that the Saudi ambassador to Washington was not blown up in Café Milano by the Iranians. This type of engagement that started developing between Mexico and the United States had never been seen before. But at the same time, there are still pressing challenges. In part, the divorce that is happening, it's unclear what's going to happen with this administration, given that Attorney General Sessions has seemed to signal a very different tack. But one of the challenging points is the divorce between domestic U.S. drug policy and international drug control policy. Why? Because you now have 9 states in the United States that have legalized a recreational use of marijuana. But countries like Mexico are still spending Churchillian quotas of blood, sweat, and tears in eradicating and seizing cannabis coming on across the border into the U.S. market. So there are a lot of politicians and public opinion in Mexico saying, why the hell are we spending resources in eradicating and seizing a product that has been legalized by 9 states in the United States? And this is putting a lot of pressure and strain on a number of international drug control agreements that Mexico and the United States have been part to for the past 20, 30 years. And so some of these tensions are starting to come to a boiling point, and with a presidential election in Mexico looming around the corner in July of 2018, issues like NAFTA and issues like a drug control policy and what Mexico does or doesn't do become a very salient issue in the debate. And then finally, the one big issue that we have not been able to wrap our arms around, and which is probably the issue that would keep us in the bin of being distant neighbors because of the huge public policy but also ideological disconnect that exists: immigration. Immigration became the third rail of the GOP 2016 primary. Immigration is the one big policy issue that both countries, despite having tried in the past, have not been able to address, in part because in many ways, most of what relates to immigration is a U.S. domestic policy issue. Yes, Mexico has a role to play in the powerful fact that it has been unable for the past 3-4 decades to hold on to talented, entrepreneurial, bold women and men that come to the United States. Our loss is your gain. But at the end of the day, solving a dysfunctional immigration policy is a domestic issue of the United States, number one. So there's very little, beyond building a wall on our side to prevent anyone from crossing, which Mexico will not do, and of slowly creating the economic conditions which have started to gel to deter, via job creation in Mexico, transmigration patterns into the United States. Remember, despite the rhetoric of the 2016 campaign, migration from Mexico to the United States has been at a net zero for the past 5 years. That means that more Mexicans are going back to Mexico than those coming across the border. Zero net migration. In part because it has become much more tougher to cross the border, in part because you can still feel some of the effects of the 2009 recession in the United States that hit the ag and the construction and the services industries pretty bad. So word of mouth is the most effective undocumented immigration policy dampener, because people say there are no jobs, and that resonates very quickly. And it is you can see how this works in communities that send migrant workers from Central America through Mexico. But it's also happened because Mexico is expanding its middle classes. This does not mean that extreme poverty is not a salient political and social issue in Mexico. Remember, Latin America isn't the poorest region in the world, but it's still the most unequal region in the world, and Mexico is no exception. But the middle classes have been expanding over the past 10, 15, 20 years in Mexico. And again, you don't have to be Paul Krugman or Joe Stiglitz to figure out why Best Buy has the largest store in terms of square feet in the world in Mexico City, and why Walmart has the largest chain of stores outside the United States in one country alone, in Mexico, because there has been an expanding middle class. And this also explains why immigration from Mexico has been profoundly decreasing over the past decade. But having said all of this, immigration and immigration reform is a truly, purely domestic U.S. policy issue. It has become extremely polarized, as all of you know. We're in the midst of a shameful and self-inflicted wound with the decision to rescind DACA. Rescinding DACA is not only failing the promise of what this country means to all these youngsters who were brought by their parents without papers to this country. This is the only country that they have known. This is the only country that they've lived in. This is the country that they have studied in. There has to be a fair and common sense solution that we can find to this issue. But when you have a debate that is so polarized, and where perceptions on both sides of the border are so divergent, because when you talk to many Americans, the majority of Americans, about immigration reform, most Americans tend to frame it in the context of legality. Have people broken the law, illicitly crossing an international border to come to the United States? Whereas if you ask Mexicans, they will frame it in the terms of fairness. Are these individuals who are contributing to the economic prosperity and well-being of the United States being treated fairly? Are they getting a fair deal for how they work and how they contribute to the economic well-being of the United States? And this is another reason why this issue has been so challenging, because when on one side of the border people approach it from a prism of legality, and on the other side of the border most Mexicans approach it from the point of view of fairness, there's also a disconnect here which makes it very challenging for both countries to find common sense solutions in how Mexico and the United States can work together. One example is what Mexico has been doing since 2014 to deter and prevent Central American migration, transmigration through Mexico on its way to the United States. It makes political sense. It certainly helped to ensure that this issue did not blow up before the 2016 election. It also makes sense in terms of Mexico's own security, knowing, just like you, knowing who crosses a border makes sense from a national security point of view. But the problem is that Mexico, by doing what it's been doing for the past 2-3 years, I'm the son of refugees on both sides of my family who came to Mexico in the 1930s. So to see what the Mexican government is doing today in ignoring the rights of many of these Central American migrants to an asylum or refugee hearing, because if they're from Guatemala, they will be mainly economic migrants and from rural areas. But if they're coming from El Salvador and from Honduras, they're mainly from urban areas fleeing the violence that has been triggered by the maras and the gangs that have supplanted in many ways, the transshipment routes that we, the United States and Mexico, have broken of cocaine coming into the international market. And by simply detaining and deporting, Mexico is probably not guaranteeing the rights of many Salvadorans and Hondurans to a asylum and refugee hearing. So I put these issues on the table because this is the one area where, despite the huge improvements that have occurred in the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship over the past 2 decades, and despite this huge, huge road bump that we now face with the Trump administration and that could profoundly torpedo U.S.-Mexico ties, this is the one issue where we have not been able to find solutions, each country on its own and both countries coming together. At the end of the day, what both governments have at stake today, regardless of party or partisan or ideological sign, is whether we understand and comprehend that Mexico and the United States have a very, very simple solution. We can continue to be accomplices to failure, or we can become partners to success. Octavio Paz, who is one of Mexico's 3 Nobel laureates, we have a Peace Nobel laureate, we have a Chemistry Nobel laureate, and we have a Literature Nobel laureate. Octavio Paz was one of Mexico's most prominent poets, essayists, and writers. And in the 70s, he wrote an essay on the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. And somewhere in the middle, he says, the reason why Mexicans and Americans don't get along is that Americans don't know how to listen and Mexicans don't know how to speak up. One of the things that happened these past 20 years that I've very quickly described for you is that Mexicans started to speak up and understand how to engage with the United States, and Americans started to listen to their neighbor. What Donald Trump today is challenging is this key dramatic shift that has occurred over the past 20 years in the bilateral relationship. Thank you very much.